second. If you have a cellar basement, that's best. But if you don't have that, get as many pillows and blankets as you can. Get in the bathtub. Get between the stool and the wall.
Imagine being a child. Imagine the TV you always trusted, now sounding terrified.
For you children that are home alone, let me talk to you for just a second. If you have a cellar basement, that's best. But if you don't have that, get as many pillows and blankets as you can. Get in the bathtub. Get between the stool and the wall. And pack yourself in there and stay there till this thing blows over.
Hearing an adult beg you to hide between the toilet and the wall, telling you to bury yourself under blankets because something unthinkable was coming. Just the raw truth spoken aloud because there wasn't time for anything softer. But that wasn't how the day started. There are days when the danger feels obvious, when dark clouds crowd the horizon from morning to noon. But May 3rd, 1999 in Bridge Creek, Oklahoma, started calm and became more scary as it progressed. This day moved slowly, like it was gathering its strength behind a curtain. A blanket of clouds that had lingered through most of the morning began to thin. Pockets of sunlight broke through, and with each hour that passed, the air seemed to get a little heavier, a little stickier, a little more charged. Forecasters across Oklahoma could sense something was different. Not because the radar showed anything unusual yet, but because the atmosphere itself had a certain tension, the kind that comes from deep moisture streaming north out of the Gulf and spreading across the plains like an invisible warning.
One storm that's trying to form, it's out south of Geary near Bridgeport. It will be moving northeastward. Now they've been going up and down. They'll gradually intensify, and as they do intensify, they most likely will become tornadic. The situation is such that conditions are quite favorable for tornadic activity and the possibility of significant tornado activity.
No one in Bridge Creek knew that this would be the day their town's name entered meteorological history. No one knew this was the day Doppler radars would capture rotational winds in excess of 300 miles per hour. And no one knew that one of the most violent tornadoes ever recorded was already forming in the mind of the atmosphere, preparing to carve a scar across Oklahoma that would alter countless lives. By midday, the scientific pieces had quietly locked into place. High moisture, deep instability, a sharpening dry line. Winds that changed direction and speed as they rose from the surface upward, what meteorologists call wind shear. These are the four pillars that support the structure of a violent tornado outbreak: moisture, instability, lift, and shear. And on May 3rd, all four were not just present, they were unusually strong. To most people, the day didn't look threatening. But on the computers of the Storm Prediction Center in Norman, Oklahoma, something unsettling was happening. Forecast models that had initially suggested a moderate risk for storms began showing more aggressive parameters. Convective available potential energy values were climbing past 5,000 joules per kilogram, a sign that air was primed to explode if lifted. The dry line sharpening to the west meant a boundary was forming where warm, moist air and hot, dry air would collide violently, creating ideal conditions for towering supercell thunderstorms. The SPC upgraded the risk, then upgraded it again. Meteorologists exchanged looks that said more than their words could. For years afterward, forecasters would describe the hours before the outbreak as textbook, but not in a comforting way. In the way a textbook lays out the steps to a disaster so clearly that you can see it unfolding before it happens. Out in the field, storm researchers with the Vortex project and mobile Doppler units began positioning themselves across central Oklahoma. They weren't expecting a typical spring event, they were expecting something far more serious.
So from North Bridge Creek to Newcastle, to southwest Oklahoma City, to Moore, to Del City, as I mentioned, South Oklahoma City, Del City, Midwest City, Tinker, Draper. Tornado warning continues in effect. We have people all around this. No tornado has touched down as of yet, but it is a strong circulation.
As the afternoon shadows grew longer, the sky still seemed tame. The public saw clearing. Forecasters saw trouble. And somewhere west of Lawton, the first storm was about to form. The storm that would spawn the strongest tornado ever measured. Around 3:30 to 4 p.m, the day's true character revealed itself. A lone thunderstorm fired near the Red River, southwest of Lawton. At first, it looked like any other spring storm. A small updraft, a growing anvil cloud. But within minutes, meteorologists could see that this storm wasn't feeding off the energy in the atmosphere. It was devouring it. The storm's updraft tightened. Rotation appeared. Lightning began to flicker inside the cloud mass like the flickering nerves of an awakening giant. The supercell didn't hesitate or wobble. It strengthened with purpose, as if it had been waiting for the exact moment when the atmosphere was ripe. By 4:47 p.m., the National Weather Service issued the first tornado warning of the day. Radar signatures showed a developing mesocyclone, a rotating thunderstorm, the precursor to a tornado formation. The storm intensified so quickly that even experienced meteorologists found themselves recalibrating expectations in real time. Chasers scrambled. Helicopters launched. Television stations interrupted programming. Whatever was happening inside that storm was stronger, faster, and more explosive than what the models had suggested even hours earlier. In meteorology, when a rotating column of air pulls inward, it spins faster. The storm's rotation intensified quickly, much quicker than typical for early supercells in an outbreak. The storm was announcing itself, and as it moved northeast, it began a chain of tornadoes that grew stronger with each cycle. Every chaser on the road that afternoon knew they were witnessing the beginnings of something historic. They just didn't know how historic. Not yet. Supercells often cycle. They produce a tornado, weaken, reorganize, then spawn another. But on this day, one supercell would behave like a relentless machine. After its first tornado, it produced another, then another, then another, each larger, more intense, and more violent. The Chickasha airport was struck by one of the early tornadoes, a powerful EF5 that sent debris flying across runways and tore apart aircraft hangars. Emergency managers knew the day was deteriorating faster than they could communicate updates. The supercell maintained its structure with astonishing efficiency. It didn't collapse. It didn't lose energy. It didn't drift off course. Instead, it pushed steadily northeast, as if it had a destination. Storm chasers watching the radar display inside their vehicles could see the mesocyclone, the heart of the rotating storm, was strengthening, not weakening. A vibrant hook echoed wrapped around the core, and the velocities inside the storm were climbing. This wasn't normal cyclical behavior. This was the atmospheric equivalent of a freight train gathering speed. Most violent tornadoes develop quickly, peak, and weaken. This storm didn't follow that rule. It kept building, layer after layer of energy compounding inside it. And soon, it would reach the outskirts of a small community southwest of Oklahoma City, a place few people outside the region had ever heard of. Bridge Creek, a town about to face the strongest winds ever measured on the planet. At approximately 5:26 p.m., near the towns of Amber and Bridge Creek, the storm lowered a rotating funnel. It was not a rope tornado. It wasn't a slender funnel weaving through an open field. It touched down, already massive, already violent, already a menace. This was the birth of the Bridge Creek Moore tornado. Chasers immediately saw the scale. The tornado widened so fast that video footage shows it expanding into a wedge shape within the first moments of contact with the ground. It was dense, dark, and enormous, its rotation throwing out debris almost instantly, a sign that the winds near the surface were already extreme. Power flashes erupted along rural roads, bright blue and green bursts marking where electrical infrastructure was being torn apart. Trees were yanked from the ground, entire structures disintegrated upon impact. Mobile Doppler radars positioned by the Vortex project began scanning the tornado, and inside the storm's violent core, they measured winds exceeding 300 miles per hour. Eventually, one reading would stand out, an astonishing 318 miles per hour. To this day, it remains the highest wind speed ever recorded on Earth. But at 5:26 p.m., no one knew the exact number yet. They only knew that a monster had been born. Live on KFOR and KWTV, anchors begged viewers to take shelter immediately. Some chasers, overwhelmed by the scale of the tornado, broke their usual calm narration and shouted warnings into their cameras. The tornado wasn't just big, it wasn't just strong, it looked like it had no intention of weakening.
Don't get out and look. This is a huge tornado, and we've had to work around people, and it's very, very dangerous. But I am in Newcastle, and it's about a mile wide, Mike, this tornado.
This wasn't hyperbole. This wasn't dramatization. The tornado began moving northeast toward Bridge Creek, its width increasing with every passing minute. It would soon reach its most violent phase, and the people in its path had only moments left to react. Bridge Creek was a quiet, rural community. Spread out homes, small family farms, wide open fields. Many houses had no basements. Few had storm shelters. And the tornado approaching them wasn't giving anyone much time to think or decide. Within minutes of touching down, the tornado grew to nearly a mile wide. At its maximum width, it reached about 0.6 to 1 miles, an enormous size for a tornado carrying EF5 level winds. As it entered Bridge Creek, the destruction became indescribable. Homes were swept from their foundations and scattered into fields as fine debris. Vehicles were hurled hundreds of yards. Trees were not just stripped, but ripped from the ground entirely. The town's water towers and steel structures crumpled like toys. Even pavement was scoured in places. Some of the most extreme damage ever surveyed by the National Weather Service was documented here. The tornado's inner core, where those 300+ mile-per-hour winds rotated, left nothing more than bare slabs and a few scattered belongings. Emergency managers who arrived afterward described scenes they struggled to put into words. Even seasoned meteorologists were stunned. Bridge Creek had taken the full brunt of one of the most violent atmospheric events ever recorded. This was the tornado's peak intensity. The Doppler on wheels would later confirm it. The debris pattern would later verify it. The death toll and destruction would later remind Oklahoma of it. But during those minutes in Bridge Creek, none of that mattered. Families were fighting for their lives. And in one home, on a gravel road, a young mother clutched her infant daughter as the walls around them began to shake. In a small home near Bridge Creek, 19-year-old Amy Saigo was spending the evening with her 10-month-old daughter Aaliyah and her parents Robert William and Catherine Williams. They knew storms were coming. But like so many Oklahomans, they had sheltered from tornado warnings before. They had weathered strong winds and close calls. They believed they understood the risk. But as the updates poured in and the warning language escalated, Robert William insisted they take shelter immediately. They gathered inside a small interior closet, the safest place in the house. Amy held Aaliyah tightly, her arms wrapped around her baby as the roar outside intensified. What happened next unfolded in seconds. The house shook violently. The walls began to buckle. The sound grew louder than a jet engine. The pressure changed, making it hard to breathe. Amy tightened her grip on Aaliyah as the closet walls started ripping apart. Then the tornado hit them directly. The closet exploded. The house disintegrated around them. The family was torn apart by winds stronger than anything a human being can hold against. Amy's arms were ripped open. She felt her grip on Aaliyah slipping. She fought the wind with everything she had, but the tornado's force was beyond anything she or anyone could withstand. Her baby was pulled from her grasp by the wind. Amy was thrown into a nearby field, badly injured but alive. Robert William was critically injured. Catherine did not survive. And Aaliyah, just 10 months old, was gone. Or so everyone believed. As the tornado moved on from Bridge Creek, emergency responders began arriving through the chaotic maze of debris. Power lines were down. Roads were blocked. Houses were gone. Nothing looked familiar. And somewhere within that devastation, a sheriff's deputy searching for survivors heard a faint sound near the base of a tree. At first, he thought it was the wind. Then he heard it again. A soft cry beneath the rubble. He rushed forward and began digging. Under shattered boards, insulation, and pieces of destroyed home, he found a small bundle. A baby, unmoving, her skin covered in dirt and scratches, her chest barely rising. He lifted her gently, believing he was holding a child who had not survived. But she moved and began to cry. He wrapped her in his jacket, stunned that such a tiny human being had endured winds strong enough to fling cars like stones. Aaliyah lived. Amy survived. Robert survived. Catherine died, protecting her family. Their story became one of the most powerful symbols of survival in the history of American tornado disasters. Rescue workers called Aaliyah the miracle baby. News outlets around the country shared her story, and Bridge Creek, in its grief, found a reason to hope amidst overwhelming loss. After tearing through Bridge Creek with winds no instrument had ever measured before, the tornado continued its path toward the northeast. It did not weaken. If anything, it appeared to grow, its condensation funnel broadening, its debris cloud deepening, its forward speed holding steady at 35 to 40 miles per hour. The parent supercell remained a perfectly tuned engine of rotation, and the tornado underneath it looked unstoppable. Chasers watching from rural roads stared in disbelief as the wedge grew darker and wider. They were no longer describing a storm. They were describing a force of nature that had surpassed anything they'd chased before, and those same chasers began radioing desperate warnings to anyone listening. The tornado wasn't veering. It wasn't drifting. It was locked onto a path that pointed directly toward Moore, Oklahoma, one of the most densely populated cities in the Oklahoma City metro. Inside the National Weather Service office in Norman, meteorologists reviewing velocity data recognized that the rotation was not just strong, it was life-ending. The storm's debris signature showed large objects being lofted miles into the air. Radar operators could see the violent core as clearly as a fingerprint. In that moment, they made a historic decision. They issued the first tornado emergency in United States history. It was a phrase never used before. Tornado warnings were common in Oklahoma. This was different. A tornado emergency meant one thing. A confirmed violent tornado was heading directly toward a metropolitan area. It meant the highest level of danger. It meant lives were already being lost, and many more were at stake. News anchors in Oklahoma City felt the gravity of the moment as updates poured in through their earpieces. They didn't bother softening their words. They didn't try to sound calm. This was not the time for professionalism. It was the time for truth.
Get below ground, even if it's 2 homes away from you. If you live in Moore or Norman, go there now and get below ground as this comes on in. We just can't take any chances as the tornado is very large and very strong.
People scrambled for shelter. In homes without basements, families dove into closets, bathtubs, and interior rooms. In mobile home parks, residents abandoned their trailers and ran for the nearest sturdy structure they could find. At schools, coaches and teachers rushed children into hallways and storm shelters. Some families fled by car, trying to outrun a tornado whose path no longer allowed guesswork. Traffic along key highways became chaotic. Some drivers panicked and abandoned their vehicles on the shoulder. Others reversed direction entirely. The tornado grew closer with each minute, a wall of black extending across the horizon, and ahead of it lay Moore, a city that would soon face one of the darkest moments in its history. The tornado entered the southwestern edge of Moore and unleashed destruction on a scale the city had never seen before. Entire neighborhoods were erased in seconds. Blocks that had been filled with 2-story homes, cars, trees, and family belongings became flat, indistinguishable fields of debris. Moore sat directly in the tornado's intensified phase. In the damage surveys that followed, meteorologists documented some of the most extreme findings ever recorded. Houses were not just stripped, they were disintegrated. Vehicles were hurled hundreds of yards. Steel beams twisted like ribbon. Trees were shredded to their cores. Splinters replaced forests. Silence replaced neighborhoods. Residents described the sound as a freight train combined with an explosion. Many never heard the warning sirens. The roar drowned them out. Survivors emerged from bathtubs and storm shelters to find that nothing familiar remained. Their homes were gone. Their streets were gone. Their landmarks were gone. Emergency responders struggled to navigate what looked like a battlefield. Power lines lay across roads. Fires burned where gas lines had ruptured. Piles of debris blocked access to entire neighborhoods. Firefighters and police officers searched for survivors, calling out into the twisted wreckage. The tornado had moved through Moore with catastrophic efficiency, leaving behind a corridor of destruction that would take years to comprehend. Dozens of people died, thousands of homes were destroyed. The cost soared into the billions. And yet, even as the tornado moved away from Moore, it was not done. It still had miles to go. As the tornado exited Moore, it entered more urban terrain. Power substations fell. Industrial parks were damaged. Vehicles on interstates were flipped and hurled across ramps. The tornado still carried EF3 and EF4 levels of energy. Still deadly, still destructive, still filled with debris that had once been homes. In Del City and Midwest City, more neighborhoods were torn apart. First responders raced ahead of the storm, trying to clear traffic and warn residents. Some neighborhoods were hit so quickly that families barely had time to dive into hallways before their homes collapsed around them. Even after nearly an hour on the ground, the tornado showed no sign of immediate collapse. It maintained its circulation. It maintained its structure. And as it moved toward Tinker Air Force Base, emergency crews braced for the possibility of damage to aircraft and infrastructure. Finally, around 6:23 p.m., after 75 to 80 minutes of continuous destruction, the tornado lifted for the last time. It left behind a 38-mile scar, one of the longest and most destructive tornado paths in Oklahoma history.
And it's just eerie. I've never been in a war zone, don't want to be, but I can't imagine the devastation being much worse than this. I mean, the entire neighborhood, as you just said, is just absolutely destroyed. About half a mile to a mile wide, and the damage goes on for miles and miles.
But for thousands of families, the nightmare was not over. It was just beginning. Search and rescue operations began immediately. Hospitals prepared for mass casualties. Neighborhoods that once felt safe were now unrecognizable. And in one rural town, far from the spotlight, survivors waited for help that would be slow to arrive. While national news crews focused on more, Bridge Creek was suffering in silence. Hours after the tornado passed, the rural community lay in ruin. Homes destroyed, families displaced, survivors wandering through the fields of debris searching for anything recognizable. But unlike the metropolitan areas where emergency resources poured in quickly, Bridge Creek found itself largely alone. The roads were blocked, communication lines were down, and because media coverage centered on Moore and the Oklahoma City metro, Bridge Creek's crisis remained largely unseen. Residents described frustration, exhaustion, and heartbreak. Some slept on the floors of damaged homes because they had nowhere else to go. Others burned piles of debris because no cleanup crews had arrived. People guarded their properties with whatever tools they could find, terrified of looters who drove through the wreckage looking for valuables.
We can't wait on anybody. We're ready to move back. Sleeping on the floor is not fun. We're ready to come back and have our own home again.
For many, the days after the tornado were worse than the storm itself. Survivors navigated a landscape of uprooted trees, crushed vehicles, and destroyed homes. They sifted through what remained of their lives, knowing the national attention was elsewhere. It would take weeks before Bridge Creek began to see adequate support, and for some residents, the sense of being forgotten never fully healed. But even in the middle of devastation, stories like Amy and Aaliyah's offered a glimmer of hope, a reminder that amid tragedy, miracles can emerge. When the damage surveys were completed, the numbers told a story almost too large to comprehend. The Bridge Creek Moore tornado was rated an EF5, the highest category in the Fujita scale at the time. More than 8,000 homes were damaged or destroyed. 36 people died in this tornado alone, and 46 across the entire outbreak. The financial cost reached almost $1.2 billion, an enormous figure for 1999, making it one of the costliest tornadoes in American history at the time. But of all the statistics, one stood above the rest. The 318 mile per hour wind measurement detected by the Doppler on wheels. No other wind speed on the planet in any natural event has ever been measured that high. Not in hurricanes, not in other tornadoes, not anywhere on Earth. This measurement changed the way meteorologists understood tornado dynamics. It forced researchers to re-evaluate the structural standards for homes, schools, and storm shelters. It influenced how warnings were issued, how models were built, how communities prepared.
You know, May 3rd, 1999 is the tornado that we study in meteorology school.
When meteorologists talk about extreme tornadoes, they talk about May 3rd, 1999. When students learn about storm structure, tornado genesis, debris signatures, and high-end rotational velocities, they learn through the lens of this event. The Bridge Creek Moore tornado didn't just reshape landscapes, it reshaped science. For most cities, one catastrophic tornado in a lifetime is enough to define an era. For Moore, destiny had a different plan. In 2013, just 14 years after the Bridge Creek Moore tornado, another violent EF5 tore through the city. It followed a path eerily similar to the 1999 storm, hitting neighborhoods that had been rebuilt from the ground up. Schools, homes, and entire blocks that had risen from the rubble were flattened again. For the survivors of the 1999 tornado, it was a nightmare repeating itself. The sound of the sirens triggered memories buried deep beneath years of recovery. Parents who had shielded their children in closets found themselves doing the same thing again, this time with teenagers who barely remembered their first brush with disaster. Moore became known as one of the most tornado-struck cities in America. The community rebuilt once, then rebuilt again. Building codes strengthened. Storm shelters became more common. Schools invested in hardened safe rooms. The scars of 1999 didn't fade. They prepared the city for the next battle. Moore's story became one of resilience, one of defiance, one of a community refusing to surrender to the randomness of nature. But the legacy of the strongest tornado ever measured doesn't belong only to Moore. It belongs to Bridge Creek, to the families who survived, to the families who didn't, and to the scientists who continued to study the storm that rewrote the record books. Today, when meteorologists discuss the upper limits of tornado strength, They talk about May 3rd, 1999. When emergency managers plan for the worst-case scenarios, they use the Bridge Creek Moore tornado as the benchmark. When researchers study debris patterns, rotational velocities, and tornado genesis, they return to the data collected that day. But beyond the science and statistics, the story of this tornado is fundamentally human. It is Amy waking in a field, battered and bruised, believing her child had been taken from her, only to learn that her daughter survived. It is Robert fighting through pain to search for his family. It is a sheriff's deputy lifting debris with his bare hands and hearing the faint cry of a baby who should not have lived. It is neighbours helping neighbours, strangers becoming rescuers, and communities rebuilding from nothing. And it is the heartbreak of those who did not survive, whose names are remembered in memorials across southern Oklahoma. The Bridge Creek Moore tornado remains, to this day, the most powerful wind event ever measured on Earth. Its legacy is written in